Russia is a country of enormous contrasts, a country where luxury and poverty often live literally on the same wall, and the language of the street has long since become a faithful witness to what official propaganda tries to hide. Russian slang is not just a collection of vulgarities or jokes. It is a living social encyclopedia in which every word carries the weight of history, frustration, and a specific black humor that allows millions of people to survive yet another week from paycheck to paycheck or from bottle to bottle. The first word is bomsh, and although today it functions as a colloquial term for a homeless person, its history is much more complex and tells us something fundamental about how the Soviet state viewed its own citizens. The word comes from an abbreviation used in official police documents, bez opredelonego mesta jitielstva, which literally means without a specified place of residence. In the Soviet Union, where every citizen was formally assigned to a specific address, a specific factory, and a specific social cell, a person without an address was a person outside the system, excluded, invisible, almost non-existent from the state's point of view. After the collapse of the USSR, the word entered common usage because suddenly millions of Russians found themselves in exactly this situation. Factories were closing overnight, company housing was ceasing to be housing, and people were going out onto the street with a suitcase and documents that suddenly opened no doors. Today, from 500,000 to over 1 million bomzheshes live in Russia, although aid organizations say the number may be much higher, because a large portion of the homeless never appears in any statistics. The second word is gopnik, and if you have ever seen online photos of men in tracksuits crouching by an apartment block with a cigarette and a beer in hand, then you already know what this is about. The gopnik is a phenomenon deeply rooted in Soviet and post-Soviet poverty culture. The word itself probably comes from the abbreviation GOP, Gosudarstvennoye Obshtezhitie, meaning state shelter, although some linguists point to other etymologies connected with the names of specific districts in St. Petersburg. Regardless of the word's origin, the gopnik as a social phenomenon is a product of concrete conditions. Housing estates built on the outskirts of Soviet cities, a lack of prospects, a lack of education that could be applied in real life, and a specific street hierarchy in which respect is earned through fear rather than achievement. Gopniks create their own subcultures, their own linguistic code called fenya, and their own rules of honor, which from the outside look absurd, but inside the community are enforced with an iron hand. The characteristic crouching position, called na kortochkach, supposedly comes from prisons, where sitting on cold concrete could lead to illness, so prisoners crouched. The third word is sinyak, and although it is associated with a bruise after a blow, in Russian slang it means an alcoholic, someone who drinks compulsively and regularly, someone for whom alcohol has become the only reason for structuring the day. The etymology is simple and brutal at the same time. Chronic alcoholism causes a characteristic bluish discoloration of the nose and cheeks. Blood vessels burst, and the face takes on a purplish-red hue that is visible in the street from several meters away. Russia has been struggling with alcoholism for centuries on a scale unmatched by any other large country. In Tsarist times, vodka was one of the state's main sources of income, so the authorities were vitally interested in subjects drinking as much as possible. In the Soviet era, drunkenness was officially condemned, but at the same time, vodka was one of the few goods that were always available and relatively cheap. After the collapse of the USSR, the market was flooded with toxic alcohol substitutes, denatured spirits, windshield de-icer fluids, perfumes with a high alcohol content, and deaths from alcohol poisoning rose to levels unimaginable in Western countries. Statistics say that in the 1990s and the early 2000s, alcohol was the direct or indirect cause of nearly 40% of all deaths among men of working age in Russia. A sinyak is not a figure from the margins. It is often a former engineer, a former officer, a former teacher who lost his job, lost his sense of purpose, and found in the bottle the only available anesthesia. The fourth word is bichevat, and its related bish, words that in Russian slang describe someone who has been pushed to the absolute bottom of society, someone who lives from day to day collecting scrap metal, looking for food in dumpsters, doing the simplest odd jobs for pennies. The etymology of this word is fascinating and reaches the Russian Far East. It comes from the English word beach, because that is what sailors were called who, after the end of their contract, were left on the shore without work or means of support, wandering around ports in search of anything at all. The word moved from port jargon into all Russian slang, and today describes an entire class of people who have fallen out of the system with no possibility of return. A beach differs from a bomj in that he usually still has some kind of roof over his head. He may sleep in an abandoned railway carriage. He may be in a garden shed on suburban plots. Someone may still let him in for the night. But his existence is so degraded, so stripped of any prospects, that the difference between him and a homeless person is purely formal. The fifth word is kaltura, and this is one of those words that show how poverty changes one's attitude toward work and quality. Kaltura means work done carelessly, shoddily, sloppily, but work for which one is paid anyway. In a broader sense, it also means additional unofficial assignments, extra concerts, extra construction jobs, extra hours with a private employer. Everything that allows one to make ends meet when the official salary is not enough for rent and food at the same time. The word entered the language in the Soviet era, when musicians and artists traveled to the provinces to play at weddings and factory parties for extra payment that officially did not exist. Today, kaltura is an inseparable element of the Russian informal economy, which according to various estimates accounts for from 20 to 40% of all economic activity in the country. Kaltura is also a symptom of a deeper problem, a system in which honest, reliable work was never rewarded sufficiently. So people learn to do everything quickly, cheaply, and not necessarily well. Because why invest effort in something for which you will get the same amount anyway? The sixth word is nishcheta, a word that, unlike the economically neutral concept of poverty, carries within it the entire emotional depth of Russian deprivation. Nishcheta is total, all-encompassing misery, the kind that gets into the bones in winter and stays there through the summer. Misery visible in children's complexions, in shoes sewn together with wire, in soup cooked from one bone over 3 days. In today's Russia, the official poverty line is an amount for which it is hard to imagine normal functioning. And according to official data, several percent of society live below that threshold. Although independent organizations speak of much higher numbers, especially in the provinces, far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, in small towns and villages, where the only work is work in a mine or at a sawmill, if it still exists. The seventh word is bukat, that is, simply to drink alcohol intensively, continuously, and without restraint. This word does not describe having a civilized glass of wine with lunch. It describes multi-day drinking binges, drinking from morning until losing consciousness. Drinking as the only form of spending free time, which in Russia, especially in small towns, is far too abundant because there is nothing else to do. Bukat is a word that in ordinary conversation appears without any shade of shame. It is part of the landscape, part of normality, something the neighbor does, something the son-in-law does, something half the village does on Saturday and the other half on Friday. The Russian spirits market is one of the largest in the world, and per capita consumption of pure alcohol has for years remained at levels that the World Health Organization classifies as a public health crisis. Bukat is also a word that hides a specific bitter Russian philosophy. In a country where a single person cannot change anything, where the system is insensitive to individual fates, where tomorrow is by definition uncertain, drinking becomes a rational response to an irrational reality. The eighth word is musor, in the colloquial sense, and ment, two slang terms for a police officer that say a great deal about the relationship between Russian society and law enforcement. Musor literally means trash, garbage, and that is exactly the word the street chose to describe a law enforcement officer. Ment probably comes from the Romani language or from 18th century criminal jargon, and for decades functioned as a more neutral, though still unofficial name for a policeman. Both words carry the same message. The police in Russia are not seen as an institution protecting the citizen, but as a repressive institution serving power and its own interests, ready to take a bribe, ready to turn a blind eye to anything for the right amount, but ruthless toward the ordinary person who just happens not to have anything to pay with. Corruption in the Russian police is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule, well known to everyone and accepted in a specific way, because everyone understands that a militianer or policeman earns poorly and has to make up the budget somehow. The ninth word is derevnya, which officially means simply a village or small settlement, but in urban Russian slang, it has taken on a deeply contemptuous tone. Derevnya is a backwater, backwardness, a province that got stuck in time somewhere in the middle of the last century and has no intention of moving on. People say "Eto takaya derevnya" about a primitive person, about a place without infrastructure, about a mental attitude based on distrust of everything new. But the Russian countryside is also a place of genuine material catastrophe that has lasted for decades. After the collapse of the collective farms, millions of hectares of land were abandoned, schools were closed, rural hospitals were liquidated under so-called optimization, shops went bankrupt, and people of working age moved to the cities, leaving behind the elderly and those who simply lacked the strength or courage to leave. The 10th word is avos, and this is probably the most important word in the entire set, because it describes not so much a specific social situation as an entire way of thinking, an entire philosophy of survival that for centuries allowed Russians to function in conditions in which logic would have dictated giving up. Avos means maybe it will somehow work out, maybe it will sort itself out, maybe something will happen, maybe God will grant it. It is the somehow it will work out raised to the level of a metaphysical principle organizing life. Avos makes it possible not to repair the roof because maybe it will not rain. It makes it possible not to save for retirement because maybe something will change. It makes it possible to drink today because tomorrow may be better or worse, and that is an even more important reason to drink today. Avos is a word that philosophers and sociologists have long pointed to as one of the key explanations for the specific Russian inability to plan long-term, to build institutions, to reform the system from within. Leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to watch the next video. There is even more waiting for you there.